Does all of this box you in for your ability to make policy?
So does the market have it wrong? I think the only answer to that is we'll see. Because our job is to respond to the data as it evolves, and I, at this point, I would not be prepared to predict, as well as I'm sure someone would come out of the wings and wrestle me to the ground were I to try to predict. But I would not be prepared to predict what the decision would be at the next meeting, and the decision for the meeting after that will depend on how the data evolves. But it's closely related to the second question of are markets correctly evaluating the likely decision function of the Fed, if you will, response function of the Fed to evolutions in the data. So the markets pricing in future rate cuts, if you will, is they're having a view about how data are likely to evolve and therefore what we're likely to do in the face of that evolution. And that puts a very high premium on our correctly describing what it is that we're likely to do. None of us can while we have to have views, we can't really predict how the data are likely to evolve. But we ought to have coherent enough intellectual frameworks in which we're thinking about monetary policy that we can communicate that and that people can have a reasonable idea that if things evolve this way, then the Fed is likely to evolve this way. Now that's a further complicated issue with the fact that the decision is taken by with a full complement. That's 19 people around the table, and I think that is that function of Fed governance is underestimated a lot, even by quite experienced Fed observers. That when I first arrived at the job and Janet Yellen was still the chair, one of the first things I said to her after a couple of FOMC meetings was, I knew you had an important job. I had no idea how hard it was, because everyone thinks that your job is to figure out what the interest rate ought to be, but you also have to manage this, motley crew of 19 people into a sensible outcome, who all have different ways of thinking about it, even if they agree on what the outcome ought to be. And therefore, the communication from all the various members can be difficult for markets then to interpret. That President Bullard thinks one way and that I think one way, and then Jay's job is to communicate for the committee, not necessarily his particular view, but he has to communicate for everyone. It's an enormously nuanced and complex process, but the job of Fed communications is to try to ensure that we are as clear about it as possible.
When you go to the meeting,